Okay, good afternoon. Thanks for staying back. It's been a long day, I think, so you've all done very well. Maybe you've all entered the competition and just staying back to get the results later. Who knows? You've probably had lots of PowerPoints today and been thinking a lot. So what I want to try and do is just wind it down a bit and show you lots of pictures and tell you lots of stories, and then we can all go home after we found out who won the competition. There's 4 things. There we go. Thank you. There's 4 things I'd like to touch on in the next half hour or so, and then maybe throw it open to a few questions. The first one is the concept of innovation and just turning on its head some of our thinking and thoughts around how stuff gets fixed and how stuff gets done. Also talk a little bit about innovation and entrepreneurship in a developing world. So on my travels, I've seen lots of really quite interesting things and taken lots of photographs of quite interesting things. And I think it's worth highlighting some of the innovation that, again, goes on without us really realizing it and without it really being planned, or at least not by people who have gone to university and studied it, which I think is important. Also, of course, touch on Frontline SMS, which is a messaging platform I developed in 2005, which is being used around the world to solve all sorts of things that people consider important problems where they live. And then finally, just touch on why I think Frontline SMS in particular has worked, but also what I think we should be looking to do when we try to apply technologies in a development or conservation or social setting. But before I start, I think a bit of a reality check is always useful. Technology today is getting faster and quicker, and in a way smaller, but things are, funnily enough, starting to get big again. Our phones have started getting bigger than they were a few years ago, so the size is a little bit variable. But there's this kind of sense that innovation is just rampantly firing along and things are getting better the whole time. And sometimes we don't even stop to think why that's happening. We just expect the next iPhone to be amazing and to have amazing things, whether or not we actually need them. Also, you find, certainly in the world I live in the development world, that the cooler and the later the tech, the more buzz and excitement you get. And sometimes that can be a bad thing. Again, we can get carried away with the technology and not actually remember what it is we're trying to solve. This is a tweet which I picked up a couple of years ago. I've blanked out the person who was doing this because I didn't want to embarrass them. But to me, the concept of using iPads with African farmers is a little bit premature. I don't think I've ever seen an African farmer with an iPad, and I'm sure you could do quite wonderful things with an iPad, but iPads just aren't out there in any number, and the farmer would have to work for 15 years and save all his salary to afford an iPad. So I don't think that's particularly relevant. So just as a reality check at the beginning, sometimes the technologies that actually work best are the ones which we've had around for a long time, and many people may consider quite boring and dull. Sadly, funders also often see them as boring and dull, and the money chases the other stuff which isn't working. So going first back to this concept of innovation and different kinds of innovation. Last summer, Wired offered me the chance to write 800 words for the magazine, and I was quite excited to do that. And I had to think about what I'd write about. And I wrote about something which I've increasingly noticed during my work and helping and mentoring innovators and entrepreneurs and going through universities and so on. This whole concept of people fixing problems that found them, rather than people going out to find the problem to fix. The way the world seems to work today, when we look at social entrepreneurship classes at universities and innovation classes, and the whole concept in the way of social innovation and technology innovation, is that you find a cool technology, then you go and find something it can solve. And that's sort of how it is often done, even though it's a little bit backwards. For me, reluctant innovators are people who actually find a problem, and it's such an annoying problem. It's a problem which disturbs them, really pees them off, and they just don't turn their back on it. They decide to fix it because it's really got to them. And I'll give you a few examples of people who I consider to be reluctant innovators. So this is Eric Hirschman, a very good friend of mine who created the iHub in Nairobi, which some of you may have heard of. Also co-founder of Ushahidi, blogs as White African. Eric and a bunch of his Kenyan friends, Eric was born in Africa, were just going about their daily business about 4 years ago when this happened. The Kenyan election crisis kicked off. And out of nowhere, Kenyans started killing Kenyans. And it got really, really nasty. And Eric and his friends noticed that most of the news coming out of Kenya was coming from the main news agencies. And it was coming from the capital cities and the main centres of population, but nothing was really coming from the other places. Nothing was coming from the rural areas. And they felt it was important to document what was going on so that when it was all over, people could figure out how it can be fixed and not actually happen again. But half of it wasn't being documented. So over 5 days, they built a very rough and dirty map, called it Ushahidi, and threw it out and started getting people to send in messages via email, SMS, web form, to report things that were happening where they were. Today, Ushahidi is used in a couple of hundred countries. It pretty much powered the Haiti earthquake response. The international aid agencies all used it to coordinate their efforts. It's used in earthquakes, tsunamis, snowmageddon. It's used in tube strikes, holes in the road, almost anything you can possibly imagine. The beauty with Ushahidi is it started with no money, was done over 5 days, and was done as a response to something that bugged people. They weren't looking for something to fix. They weren't sitting in a hackathon trying to identify the best problem they could find for a particular technology. And then this is Bridge Kathari, a friend of mine who I worked with at Stanford for a while. And Bridge was learning Spanish at the time, and he was in New York with some friends eating pizza and watching a Spanish film, Women on the Verge. Well, it's not a Spanish film, but a film which had Spanish subtitles on it. And he was watching this film, and he realized that, so it had English subtitles and Spanish audio. And as a Spanish learner, he realized that if he could actually read the words in the same language as the audio, then actually he could learn his Spanish a bit better. Normally, subtitles are not in the same language that you're hearing. The idea is it's translated into a different language. So he thought, well, in India, lots of children struggle with reading. Why don't we get Bollywood to put on films and videos the Hindi that the children are hearing so they can read it on the screen as they actually watch the film and sing along with the songs? And he's done that. He invented or developed a concept called same language subtitling. He's been doing it for years now. Amazingly, today, about 300 million Indian school children get their first taste of reading skills through same language subtitling. Now again, Bridge was eating pizza, watching a DVD. He wasn't looking for a problem, and he's created something quite profound. And then finally, Laura Stachel, again, somebody I've had a great pleasure of meeting and working with a bit over the years. Laura's a pediatrician from the US, went to Nigeria to do some research on child mortality, a few bits and pieces for a research project. And when she got there, she very, very soon realized that the problem she was looking for out there and the things she was looking at actually weren't really the problem at all that needed fixing. The problem was this: it was women going into the hospitals at 3 a.m. with complications of their pregnancies who've spent a day walking to the clinic, and then nobody being able to operate on them because it was too dark. There was no power, there was no light. And women were dying, and babies were dying. And it really disturbed her. She couldn't believe that lives were being lost because there was no light. So she completely forgot why she went to Nigeria. She pushed it to one side, and with her husband, developed a solar suitcase. This is a later version. The earlier versions are much cruder than this. Solar suitcase goes outside in the day, batteries are charged up, and then at night when a woman comes into the hospital who needs help, there's light. They can actually save babies and save women. You know, childbirth is supposed to be one of the most joyous things for us as humans, and it's obviously pretty horrific if you lose your wife and child during childbirth. So Laura's fixed this again without actually looking to fix it. So I've actually identified 9 or 10 people who've innovated in this way. They've done it reluctantly in a sense because they weren't problems they were looking to fix. They saw the problems and they felt compelled to solve them because nobody else seemed to be doing it. And the common thread is that they weren't qualified particularly to do it. They certainly didn't have the money to do it. So I think there's a lesson in there somewhere. I've met students in the US spending $200,000 learning social entrepreneurship. It doesn't guarantee you're going to actually fix anything. You can actually do it just by getting your backside out there and exposing yourself to the kind of problems that the world has. So how does this feed into other innovation and other entrepreneurship that's going on around the world? This is the reason I'm probably standing here today and the reason so many people have been getting excited recently. This is a mobile phone coverage map across Africa. It's slightly old, but mobile phones have probably done more for development than any development agency or maybe the entire development industry by enabling things to happen that otherwise would not have been able to happen. If the mobile phone networks had been aid projects, you might have coverage in 1 or 2 cities by now. It's private sector driven, people are getting very rich and making a lot of money, but what it's doing is it's enabling some incredible things to happen. And that innovation and entrepreneurship is split really into 2 categories. And when I've traveled around, I've kind of seen this, and I found it quite fascinating what I found. So the formal sector is what you would almost expect to see when you travel somewhere. So, you go to a hotel or a shop, and there'll be a glass cabinet, and there'll be phones in their original boxes with a guarantee and a receipt, and you'll get all the tax paid, and it's all done exactly as you'd expect it to be. You go to places, you want to buy a local SIM card, you want to buy top-up vouchers, it's all there. But the flip side to this is things like this. This I took in 2004. This is a mobile phone shop in South Africa. Somebody's just realized that mobile phones present an opportunity to start making money and running a business. So they built a shop. Very crude, probably excruciatingly hot to stand in the middle of the day. But it's an indigenous response to an opportunity. That might be one of the earliest mobile phone shops in South Africa, or maybe even Southern Africa. Mobile phone charging stations. People have phones, but they can't charge them very easily. That's a bit of a problem. So now there are people springing up all over the place building these charging stations where they have every possible charger for every model of phone. You walk up with your phone, you plug it in, you wait half an hour, you pay 30 shillings and you walk off. That keeps your phone going. A phone without power isn't particularly useful. And this is one of the reasons why the really old Nokia phones that we discarded years ago are so popular still in developing countries, because I don't know about you, but my early Nokia that I had, I couldn't make the battery go flat. It just would not die. It would just live on and on and on. My iPhone, if I use it moderately, needs charging by 4 p.m. if I use it too much during the day. That's not good if you can't charge stuff. Mobile phone technicians, repair shops, springing up again all over the place because there's really big opportunity for people to fix the phones that are breaking or to replace parts that may be faulty. There's a giant phone technician here in Uganda, and they seem to be able to fix these phones with blocks of wood and screwdrivers and hammers. I mean, it's pretty scary stuff. And again, they've not had any training. They haven't been to electrical engineering college. They've probably broken a few phones on the way, but they figured it out eventually. And if you're lucky enough, you'll take your phone in when they figured out how to do it properly. But it will actually work. Jan Chipchase, who's a Nokia anthropologist or a former Nokia anthropologist, has actually studied the whole concept of how people learn how to do this stuff, because it's just indigenous response to opportunity. We tend to think generally that people have to learn or be taught to do things. A lot of creativity in children tends to get wiped out by the education system, not nurtured. I met this guy when I was in Kampala once. He was cycling round. This is a mobile phone. Right? This guy goes to where you are. If you wave him down and you make a phone call, it's a mobile phone inside a desktop phone unit. But you wave him down, you make your call, you pay his money, and he cycles off and does the next guy. He's thrown this thing together. He's got spare bike batteries there so he can go out for the day, and he's got extra power. But again, I think that's absolutely fantastic. And interestingly with him, I only managed to convince him eventually to let me take a picture after discussing Premiership football for about 20 minutes. The best way to get people to ease and relax and to trust you in almost any African country I've been to is to talk about Chelsea and Manchester United, and it's just everywhere. It's incredible. A four-wheel version of the mobile. Again, it's a desk or payphone with mobile device inside it, but people cycle around in these. In Kenya, a lot of people with disabilities actually run these as businesses because they can actually get around, and it gives opportunities for people, or marginalized people, to actually have an income and a living. And this is one of my favorite charging ones. This is a guy I met who dragged this car battery here to the next village to charge it up, and then dragged it back to his village where there was no power and charged people money to plug their phones in to charge it up. Again, I don't know how many of you have tried lifting a car battery, but you can't do it with one hand. You can just about do it with two hands. It's not easy. And it just shows great determination, and I think great entrepreneurship that somebody's figured out how to do this, and they've hacked together a cigarette lighter socket cable and a few other bits and pieces, and it works. It works. This is a village phone. Some of you may have come across or heard of the village phone model, where usually a woman borrows a small amount of money, buys a phone, and then becomes the telephone point for the village. Grameen Village Phone has been hugely successful over the years, starting in Bangladesh and now in African countries as well. One of the problems it's faced, though, and this is one of the things now which people are beginning to realize, is that when some of these people originally got these phones, they were the only phone perhaps in the village, or the only phone maybe for a few miles. But today phones are increasingly appearing everywhere. So is there a business model anymore for this? Well, there is to an extent if you're creative. On this photo, you'll see that wire coming out the top of the phone. When I met this woman, I was chatting to her and asked her what the wire was for. And she said, You know, I'm not allowed to lower my prices because they're all set by the Village Phone franchise. I can't actually be competitive that way. But I noticed that when people made phone calls outside of the other shops, kids would gather around and it would be no privacy and it would all be pretty hard for the customer. So I let my customers go around the back of my shop to make their calls. And to make sure that those customers don't run off with my phone, there's a wire on it and it's attached to me. So the phone kind of goes out of sight, but it doesn't actually leave her. And it was just a way, again, of saying, make your call with me, because I'll let you do this and the others won't. And it's just a nice kind of, okay, maybe crazy, but it works. And she probably feeds her family and sends her kids through school because she's able to think this way. And then finally, when you look at mobile phone manufacturers who are working in these markets and seeing all this fairly random, crazy stuff going on, they have to think differently about how they market their products. This is a torch that makes phone calls. Yeah? I mean, the fact it's got a torch is seen as more important than the fact that it's a phone. And I just love this because you would never sell a phone in the UK based on the fact it's got a light on the top. I mean, I don't know how, maybe some of you have bought phones based on that, I don't know. But again, it's aimed at people who don't have power at home, don't have light at home, and having light of some description is actually a unique selling point. So they decide to make that a big feature of the product. And this happens a lot in developing countries where people have to think very differently about how they sell and market to a very, very different type of consumer who is not only price sensitive, but also wants to have value like that added. So phones are now kind of almost everywhere. It's been quite incredible. I started in 2000, well, into 2002 working with mobile technology, mostly in Africa. And at the time, people wondered what the hell I was doing because they're saying that there aren't phones in Africa. And there weren't that many. But today, if you actually question anybody using mobile phones for development or for business in Africa, you're laughed at that because they are just it's just so obvious that they're there and they're increasing. And probably within 10 years, there'll be 90% coverage. So it's just a matter of time. And phones have had a massive impact. Sometimes the mobile revolution is overhyped and we get too excited about it. And you keep hearing about how wonderful these phones are and how many lives they're saving and how, you know, Twitter and Facebook and the internet and technology has, you know, created an environment where you can overthrow dictators. Sometimes we forget actually that it's the people that have to do the overthrowing. The technology only helps that. The French Revolution didn't use Twitter, Facebook, or mobile phones. I mean, how on earth were there any revolutions before technology? You know, we need to just get a sense of that. But when you speak to entrepreneurs and people who are using phones for their businesses and to get information that maybe provides them better health or agricultural information and so on, they do feel actually this way. They do feel very strongly that it's made a huge difference to their lives. And this quote from Leonard Waverman from a few years ago, I think summarizes that probably better than any. The problem is, though, and the problem that I saw quite early on when I started working with mobile was that the sector was dominated by mostly Western non-profits who were looking at the really great, cool stuff and flying over on big planes in business class to developing countries and trying to find needy people, poor people, disadvantaged people who they could help with it. And I think that's quite condescending to an extent to do that. And development in the technology world is still largely done that way. But things are starting to change, and I can go into that a little bit later. What I found in 2003 in particular was that when you go out to communities who identify the fact that maybe phones could be useful to them in various ways, they don't want somebody to come over and offer them everything and build everything and do it and have control and ownership of that solution. They want solutions that they can control and own themselves. They don't want the UN to be pressing the big green button or the World Bank or even their government in some cases. So to make stuff work at a scale and level that people can own and control, you have to think small. And that was contrary at the time to a lot of the things that people were doing. So thinking small was exactly what I was doing when I came up with the idea for Frontline SMS, this text messaging platform. Ridiculously simple. When I speak at technology events where there's techies in the room, they get very, very disappointed when they actually see what the technology is, because it really, I think somebody mentioned a bit earlier that actually it's really quite obvious when it hits you in the face. It's a piece of software. Outlook for SMS is how it's been sometimes described. You plug a mobile phone and a cable into a cheap laptop, you add the software, it allows you to manage two-way text messaging through the phone. The advantage of this, well, there are two key advantages of this. First of all, it ran off a laptop and a phone that have batteries, so you don't need to have power all the time to make it work, and that can be a problem. Also, it doesn't need the internet. Once you have the software on the laptop, you can take it anywhere. And as long as there's one bar of mobile phone signal, you can actually use it to send and receive messages to farmers, healthcare workers, human rights activists, whoever it might be. And if there isn't mobile phone signal where you're doing that, then that's not a problem, because there's no mobile phone signal, no one's got a phone. So why would you want to send texts anyway? So they kind of flow together quite nicely. And I wrote this over a 5-week period in Finland with a very, very small amount of money, and had a hunch that if we could build a messaging hub that small grassroots nonprofits in developing countries could take on their own terms, install it themselves, not have me fly over on a plane and install it, figure out how to use it, add the contacts, add the numbers, put a SIM card in a phone, buy a cable from a local market, and do it on their own. That act alone is an act of empowerment. These people feel incredibly proud that they've managed to actually achieve something, possibly for the first time using technology on their own. And that's the kind of human element, I think, sometimes that we forget when we look at technology solutions. People need to feel part of the solution. So this is why, partly that and this, why the software has actually done incredibly well and far, far better than I ever imagined. I'll give you some examples in a few minutes, but the tool basically allows people to innovate on their own terms and to use it in their own way. When National Geographic gave me the award about 3 years ago now, they said, do you have photographs of you in the field with users so we can use on the website and so on? I have no photographs of me with users of Frontline SMS. It's being used in 140 odd countries over nearly 8 years now, and I've not been to one. And I think that's why it works. That's why it works. So here's a few examples of what's going on out there. 2007, Nigerian elections, a group of grassroots NGOs from Nigeria decided to monitor their elections. They were sick and tired of the international community coming in, doing it, only going to the bad places. They thought, let's do it ourselves. They used Frontline SMS. The international media thought, what on earth is a scrappy grassroots bunch of NGOs from Nigeria doing monitoring their own elections? How on earth did they do that? The software got interest, and it started to pick up from there. The software is now used in a large number of elections around the world to allow citizens to text into messaging hubs to report things that have gone well and not gone so well. In Zimbabwe, it's used to get news and information to and from communities that Mugabe is trying very, very hard to beat up and, in many cases, kill or destroy. And they all happen to be MDC supporters, or at least at the time they used to be. So the software opens up a really valuable channel for people who might be starved of the truth. And, you know, Zimbabwe, I think, is a great example of a very troubled country which continues to have issues. In East Africa, one of my favorite projects called Stop Stockouts, governments in these countries denied that it was hard to get hold of really essential medicines. If your child has diarrhea, you can easily go and buy diarrhea medication. If your child has malaria, you can easily go and buy malaria medication. There's no supply issues, it's just there. Non-profits on the ground knew that wasn't the case. So they got together and they crowdsourced a map where basically when people went in to try and buy one of a number of essential medicines, they couldn't get them, they mapped it. And actually those NGOs went back to the governments with this map, and they lobbied with this map and said, look, what do you mean there's no problem? Look at this. You can't deny there's a problem here. This is quite serious. And bear in mind that each of those big red blobs means dead people, basically. And that's being fixed now because of the power of using a technology which democratizes the opportunity for people to actually report stuff. In Afghanistan, it was used to send security alerts to field workers, people who are running around in pretty dangerous places trying to avoid terrorists and attack and all sorts of other things. And in Afghanistan, it was used almost from the second or third week I released it. It's been used there now for a very long time and continues to be. In Iraq, the first independent news agency since the fall of Saddam started using it to get news alerts around the country. The software supports multiple languages, so supports Arabic script and so on. Anti-human trafficking networks in Vietnam, Cameroon, Nepal, and you can add Haiti to that now as well. The beauty of communities running their own systems is that they can decide how they're used, and they can decide what the messages are, and they can decide what to do when things come in. It's not owned by anyone else. And these anti-trafficking systems just sit within small grassroots NGOs within the communities. They own and run them. They belong to them. In Afghanistan, the last election was, Frontline SMS was used to get information and news from the independent media who could go to places that the international media couldn't get to because it was too dangerous, giving a more holistic view of what had happened during the election. Kickstart pumps use it to allow people to register interest in their pumps so they can get back to them with information on special offers and when they'll be in town. And in Malawi, this is Alexander, who's using this laptop to run a rural healthcare network for 250,000 people. I met a guy called Josh Nesbitt at Stanford University a few years ago, and he was traveling to a hospital in Malawi where the healthcare workers were traveling out into the rural villages for quite lengthy amounts of time, 2 or 3 months at a time, and making notes on bits of paper, then going back to the hospital, never getting around to updating the patient records or the information. And while they're out of the hospital, there was no way of communicating back. They didn't have any way of asking a question or checking if somebody was around. What Josh did, he installed Frontline SMS on this laptop, and they gave phones out. And in the space of 6 months, they started making quite huge improvements to the way they delivered healthcare to the communities around them. They saved a huge amount of money in fuel, in hours, doctor time. Nurses who were previously jumping on motorbikes to give injections to patients who had died 1 or 2 days earlier, which was happening, that stopped happening. They could check to see if a patient was available and that they were in fact still alive. And Josh and his team created an organization from this called Frontline SMS Medic, which is now called Medic Mobile. And they built a patient record-keeping system based on text messages that allowed the healthcare workers to text in an update, which updated a patient record in real time from the field. We don't actually really even have that here. You know, we don't. Our doctors have all got the internet and PCs and probably large NHS systems that basically don't work very well. But this actually works very well in the context that it's needed. From that sprung Frontline SMS Credit. Somebody decided that if you added a microfinance module to the software to allow it to automate the payments and receipts of money over M-Pesa or any mobile phone network, you could actually run a small microfinance operation much more effectively and efficiently. And that's being trialed in various places as well. Frontline SMS Legal, looking at how you extend the reach of legal services to communities who may have land rights issues or other questions and places where the law doesn't get to. Frontline SMS Learn was looking at extending the reach of schools and education by sending quizzes and exam results and so on to pupils to save them traveling for a day to go and get an exam result that might not be out. And then Frontline SMS Radio has built a radio module which allows community radio stations in developing countries to interact in real time with their audiences via SMS while a program is going out on air. So the doctor can come into the studio and people can text in questions that the doctor can actually answer. An agricultural expert can come in and answer questions and so on. For the first time, those stations have been able to interact two-way with communities they've been largely broadcasting to, in some cases for decades. And by doing that, they can also save the messages and start to get a sense of what their audiences want. How many times do people ask questions about diarrhea or TB? Should we do a program about that? Somebody who previously asked a question about TB or diarrhea, if they're going to have a program about that in 2 weeks' time, why not text them and tell them when the program is going to be on? Suddenly it becomes a much richer experience. And because it runs off a cheap laptop and just a phone and a cable or a little modem, this is very, very cheap and affordable. This isn't a £20,000, £30,000 system that maybe 5 Live might use. The coverage map I mentioned earlier, it's about 145 countries right now. That's a slightly older map, but we've managed to get this kind of global coverage purely organically. People just talking to other people and sharing their own stories and talking about how they've used it. And because people can easily replicate what other people have done, it doesn't require money, it doesn't require me flying over or one of the team flying over. It's actually relatively easy to get this kind of growth. And there is an online community for people that can get online, and it's very, very vibrant, and people are incredibly keen and happy and willing to share what they've done with others without any coercion, and also to help other people. It gives me huge satisfaction when I get up in the morning and see on the online community that somebody in Ghana has helped somebody in Nicaragua. I mean, that's exactly what we want, right? We step back and we just let people get on with it. So, last little bit here. What do I think over the last 10 years working in mobile in particular, but working in development for the last 20 years, what do I think we need to be thinking about when we build technologies for emerging markets or developing countries? First of all, I think it's important that whatever hardware your solution uses, that people actually can get hold of that hardware, or it's even better, hardware they already have, right? So people aren't going to be able to go out and buy new stuff. This is where the iPad project fails, right? You're just not going to be able to, you could build the best iPad app in the world and it may even save the world, but not everybody's got an iPad. Also, if there's a hardware component where things need plugging together and assembling, make it easy enough so that people can actually figure out how to do that without huge complex manuals or instructional videos. Maybe IKEA is a bad example of that. I always end up with a few screws and bits of wood left over when I buy a bit of IKEA furniture. But if you show somebody a photograph of Frontline SMS, a laptop, a cable, and a phone, they pretty much figure out in no time at all they've got to plug them in like that. It doesn't require any training to do that. Price is also hugely important, and it's also a really big issue today. There's increasing demand on social ventures doing this kind of work to be financially sustainable. The problem is if you sell your product to people who don't have money to pay for it or don't have the mechanism to pay for it, which is probably more important in a lot of cases, then you're going to stifle your market. I decided at the beginning that frontline SMS was going to be free because I wanted to try and bring barriers down. I wanted people who couldn't access these kinds of technologies to be able to access them. So through the software, we brought a technology barrier down. If I put a price on it, we put a price barrier up. The net result is still a barrier. I haven't really got anywhere at all. So I decided to make it free and for it to be my problem to figure out how to actually make it financially sustainable. And thankfully, I've actually found a couple of really smart people who are running the organization now from DC and Nairobi, and they've taken on the mantle of trying to figure out how to make it financially sustainable because it's not something I'm particularly good at. Also, thinking about how the tool replicates and scales, if you like the word scales. I think it's one of those four-letter words almost in development, maybe even in social enterprise. Everyone's obsessed with scale. Not everything scales. You know, cures for rare diseases where there might only be 2,500 people on the planet who have that disease, that doesn't scale. Are you saying that it's not worth curing those 2,500 people? Because sometimes that's the message that we give. So with frontline SMS, people are actually able to copy what other people have done. It can replicate very, very easily. For us, scale is really gained by having lots of people helping small amounts of people. So if you want to help 1 million people through hospitals across Africa, rather than having one system run by the National Healthcare Service, which helps all the million, why don't you have 100 hospitals with their own system helping 20,000 people each? You still get 1 million, but it's distributed. And again, we're obsessed with centralized solutions and cloud-based solutions. Forget the internet. If you forget the internet and build something that can work without the internet, it'll work pretty much anywhere. If you need the internet, then depending where you're working, of course, you may come unstuck. Internet penetration in Zimbabwe is 4, 5, 6%. So again, if your solution is amazingly fantastic, but it requires the internet, you've lost 95% of an audience before you even launch. So I prefer to think that the internet's not there and it's a luxury, and what can you do with the very, very simple basic technologies that currently exist? And voice and SMS are the two most ubiquitous. Every phone does voice and SMS. Not every phone does data or the internet. And even the smartphone penetration figures that we keep reading about, wow, you know, there's 25% smartphone penetration in Africa. How many of that 25% is actually connected? How many people are actually using data? How many can afford to use data? Maybe only 5% of that 25% are actually actively using the internet, which means the number's actually a lot smaller. So we need sometimes to look behind the numbers to really see what's happening. Building an environment where people can connect and share and help each other is hugely important, because certainly for me, running frontline SMS on my own for the first few years, I didn't have the time to really help everybody and to answer every question. So allowing other people to take that over was not only helpful to me, but it also, again, felt empowering for them. It's important also to get out of our silos. This is my favorite Gary Larson cartoon, where these researchers are going into this village and all the villagers are hiding their VCRs and TVs because they want to look authentic and indigenous and so on. The problem I think we have in development in the social sector to a large extent is that agriculture people go to agriculture conferences, health people go to health conferences, human rights activists go to human rights conferences. By that, it's almost inferring that an agriculturalist can't learn anything from someone doing health or human rights. And to make it even worse than that, mobile health people go to different conferences to health people because they use mobile and the other guys don't. So what on earth is going on when we start to create all this separation? How are we possibly going to have any cross-fertilization of ideas and to help each other and try and learn from each other if we do that? It's absolutely crazy. This is a book which hugely influenced my thinking from 1973, Small is Beautiful by E.F. Schumacher. Sort of launched really or popularized the appropriate technology movement. Building tools that work for the people that you're intending to help. Tools that they can support and maintain on their own. Things that they can fix on their own. Things they can take ownership of. Almost everything that development doesn't do, basically, which is kind of funny. I discovered this book at university, and if you're interested in that kind of approach, it's absolutely worth reading. And it's quite scary that after 40 years, it's still relevant today as it ever, maybe it's more relevant than it ever has been. Competition's another one that bugs me. I'm sick and tired of NGOs competing with each other. you almost have a situation where you have a child in a village somewhere who's having both arms pulled by different non-profits wanting to vaccinate him, and they're actually fighting over the arms. You know, it's really quite annoying, and it's because, in a sense, it's competitive, and funding might be short, and some NGOs may need to look better than others in order to get that funding. But we're all trying to achieve the same thing. We're all trying to make the planet a better place for people to live on. And we shouldn't be competing or saying bad things about each other and trying to rubbish other people's work. Other people's work might not feel as good as yours, but you don't have to say it that way. And it may well be places where their stuff works better than yours, because the world isn't the same everywhere. And then finally, I'll leave you with this slide. This is Bushbuck Ridge on the edge of Kruger National Park in South Africa. This is where my mobile work really started in 2003, when I was trying to find a system that allowed Kruger National Parks to send messages to these people to re-engage them in the conservation effort. They'd got kicked off the land, these people, not themselves, but their parents and grandparents had been kicked off the land in the 1920s to create the park, and nobody had really spoken to them ever since. And there's a growing realization you need to engage local people for conservation to work. So the problem was, how do we send messages to these people? And that's where Frontline SMS came from. But I always go back to this picture because I find this picture incredibly challenging. There's not a lot there. These women spend their whole time queuing for water, and it's pretty much all that they do. So when I look at this, I think to myself, every week I go back and I think, have I or am I getting any closer with the work I'm doing today to actually finding solutions that genuinely help these people? Because if I'm not, I should stop and think, why? I'm not doing it just for the technology's sake. I'm doing it because I really believe that we have a great opportunity with mobile technology and technology in general to seriously solve some of the more pressing problems facing the planet today. Thank you very much. Was there time for questions, or I don't know how the time's going, but